Operation Varsity was a successful airborne forces operation launched by American, British and Canadian troops that took place toward the end of World War II, involving more than 16,000 paratroopers and several thousand aircraft. It was the largest airborne operation in history to be conducted on a single day and in one location. Part of Operation Plunder, the effort by the British 21st Army Group under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to cross the Rhine River and from there enter northern Germany. Varsity was meant to help the 21st Army Group to secure a foothold across the Rhine River in western Germany by landing two airborne divisions on the eastern bank of the Rhine near the village of Hamminkeln and the town of Asel. The plans called for the dropping of two divisions from the U.S. 18th Airborne Corps to capture key territory and to generally disrupt German defenses to aid the advance of Allied ground forces. The British 6th Airborne Division was ordered to capture the villages of Schnappenberg and Hamminkeln, clear part of the Diersviertel of German forces, and secure three bridges over the River Issel. The U.S. 17th Airborne Division was to capture the village of Diersfurt and clear the rest of the Diersviertel of any remaining German forces. The two divisions would hold the territory they had captured until relieved by advancing units of 21st Army Group, and then join in the general advance into northern Germany. The airborne forces made several mistakes, most notably when pilot error caused paratroopers from the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, a regiment in the U.S. 17th Airborne Division, to miss their drop zone and land on a British drop zone instead. However, the operation was a success, with both divisions capturing Rhine bridges and securing towns that could have been used by Germany to delay the advance of the British ground forces. The two divisions incurred more than 2,000 casualties, but captured about 3,500 German soldiers. The operation was the last large-scale Allied airborne operation of World War II. Background: by March 1945, the Allied armies had advanced into Germany and had reached the River Rhine. The Rhine was a formidable natural obstacle to the Allied advance, but if breached would allow the Allies to access the North German plain and ultimately advance on Berlin and other major cities in northern Germany. Following the broad front approach laid out by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, it was decided to attempt to breach the Rhine in several areas. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, devised a plan entitled Operation Plunder that would allow the forces under his command to breach the Rhine, which was subsequently authorized by Eisenhower. Plunder envisioned the British Second Army, under Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey, and the U.S. Ninth Army, under Lieutenant General William Simpson, crossing the Rhine at Rees, Basel, and an area south of the Lippe Canal. To ensure that the operation was a success, Montgomery insisted that an airborne component be inserted into the plans for the operation to support the amphibious assaults that would take place. This was codenamed Operation Varsity. 3 airborne divisions were initially chosen to participate in the operation, these being the British 6th Airborne Division, the U.S. 13th Airborne Division and the U.S. 17th Airborne Division, all of which were assigned to the U.S. 18th Airborne Corps. One of these airborne formations, the British 6th Airborne Division, was a veteran division. It had taken part in Operation Overlord, the assault on Normandy in June the previous year. However, the 17th Airborne Division had been activated only in April 1943 and had arrived in Britain in August 1944. Too late to participate in Operation Overlord. The division had also been absent from Operation Market Garden, and the only action it had seen was during the Ardennes campaign. It was, therefore, a relatively inexperienced formation that had never taken part in a combat drop. The 13th Airborne Division had been activated in August 1943 and was transferred to France in 1945. The formation itself had never seen action, although one of its regiments, the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had fought in Italy, southern France and the Ardennes. Prelude. Allied preparation Operation Varsity was therefore planned with these three airborne divisions in mind, with all three to be dropped behind German lines in support of 21st Army Group as it conducted its amphibious assaults to breach the Rhine. However, during the earliest planning stages, it became apparent that the 13th Airborne Division would be unable to participate in the operation, as there were only enough combat transport aircraft in the area to transport two divisions effectively. The plan for the operation was therefore altered to accommodate the two remaining airborne divisions, the British 6th Airborne and the US 17th Airborne Division. The two airborne divisions would be dropped behind German lines, with their objective to land around Wesel and disrupt enemy defences in order to aid the advance of the British Second Army towards Wesel, to disrupt the hostile defence of the Rhine in the Wesel sector by the seizure of key terrain by airborne attack, in order to facilitate the further offensive operations of the Second Army. Operational orders for 6th and 17th Airborne Divisions to achieve this. Both divisions would be dropped near the village of Hamminkeln, and were tasked with a number of objectives. They were to seize the Diersvierter Wald, a forest that overlooked the Rhine, including a road linking several towns together. Several bridges over a smaller waterway, the River Issel, were to be seized to facilitate the advance, and the village of Hamminkeln was to be captured. The Diersvierter Wald was chosen by Lt. Gen. Dempsey as the initial objective because its seizure would deny the Germans artillery positions from which they could disrupt Second Army's bridging operations. Once these objectives were taken, the airborne troops would consolidate their positions and await the arrival of Allied ground forces, defending the territory captured against the German forces known to be in the area. Operation Varsity would be the largest single-lift airborne operation conducted during the conflict. More significantly, it would contradict previous airborne strategy by having the airborne troops drop after the initial amphibious landings, in order to minimize the risks to the airborne troops learned from the experiences of Operation Market Garden. Unlike Market Garden, the airborne forces would be dropped only a relatively short distance behind German lines, thereby ensuring that reinforcements in the form of Allied ground forces would be able to link up with them within a short period. This avoided risking the same type of disaster that had befallen the British 1st Airborne Division when it had been isolated and practically annihilated by German infantry and armour at Arnhem. It was also decided by the commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, General Louis Breton, who commanded all Allied airborne forces including US 18th Airborne Corps, that the two airborne divisions participating in Operation Varsity would be dropped simultaneously in a single lift, instead of being dropped several hours apart, addressing what had also been a problem during Operation Market Garden. Supply drops for the airborne forces would also be made as soon as possible to ensure adequate supplies were available to the airborne troops as they fought. German preparation. By this period of the conflict, the number of German divisions remaining on the Western Front was rapidly declining, both in numbers and quality, a fact in the Allies' favor. By the night of the 23rd of March, Montgomery had the equivalent of more than 30 divisions under his command, while the Germans fielded around 10 divisions, all weakened from constant fighting. The best German formation the Allied airborne troops would face was the 1st Parachute Army, although even this formation had been weakened from the losses it had sustained in earlier fighting, particularly when it had engaged Allied forces in the Reichswald Forest in February. 1st Parachute Army had 3 corps stationed along the river, 2nd Parachute Corps to the north, 86th Corps in the center, and 63rd Corps in the south. Of these formations, 2nd Parachute Corps and 86th Corps had a shared boundary that ran through the proposed landing zones for the Allied airborne divisions, meaning that the leading formation of each corps, these being 7th Parachute Division and 84th Infantry Division, would face the airborne assault. After their retreat to the Rhine, both divisions were under strength and did not number more than 4,000 men each, with 84th Infantry Division supported by only 50 or so medium artillery pieces. The 7 divisions that formed the 1st Parachute Army were short of manpower and munitions, and although farms and villages were well prepared for defensive purposes, there were few mobile reserves, ensuring that the defenders had little way to concentrate their forces against the Allied bridgehead when the assault began. The mobile reserves that the Germans did possess consisted of some 150 armored fighting vehicles under the command of 1st Parachute Army, the majority of which belonged to 47th Panzer Corps. Allied intelligence believed that of the 2 divisions that formed 47th Panzer Corps, 116th Panzer Division had up to 70 tanks, and 15th Panzer Grenadier Division 15 tanks and between 20 to 30 assault guns. Intelligence also pointed to the possibility of a heavy anti-tank battalion being stationed in the area. Also, the Germans possessed a great number of anti-aircraft weapons. On the 17th of March, Allied intelligence estimated that the Germans had 103 heavy and 153 light anti-aircraft guns, a number which was drastically revised a week later to 114 heavy and 712 light anti-aircraft guns. The situation of the German defenders, and their ability to counter any assault effectively, was worsened when the Allies launched a large-scale air attack 1 week prior to Operation Varsity. The air attack involved more than 10,000 Allied aircraft and concentrated primarily on Luftwaffe airfields and the German transportation system. The German defenders were also hampered by the fact that they had no reliable intelligence as to where the actual assault would be launched. Although German forces along the Rhine had been alerted as to the general possibility of an Allied airborne attack, it was only when British engineers began to set up smoke generators opposite Emmerich and began laying a 60-mile-long smoke screen that the Germans knew where the assault would come. Battle. Operation Plunder began at 9 p.m. on the evening of the 23rd of March, and by the early hours of the morning of the 24th of March, Allied ground units had secured a number of crossings on the eastern bank of the Rhine. In the first few hours of the day, the transport aircraft carrying the 2 airborne divisions that formed Operation Varsity began to take off from air bases in England and France and began to rendezvous over Brussels, before turning northeast for the Rhine dropping zones. The airlift consisted of 541 transport aircraft containing airborne troops, and a further 1,050 troop carriers towing 1,350 gliders. The 17th Airborne Division consisted of 9,387 personnel, who were transported in 836 C-47 Skytrain transports, 72 C-46 Commando transports, and more than 900 Waco CG-4A gliders. The 6th Airborne Division consisted of 7,220 personnel transported by 42 Douglas C-54 and 752 C-47 Dakota transport aircraft, as well as 420 Airspeed Horsa and General Aircraft Hamilcar gliders. This immense armada stretched more than 200 miles in the sky and took 2 hours and 37 minutes to pass any given point, and was protected by some 2,153 Allied fighters from the U.S. 9th Air Force and the Royal Air Force. The combination of the 2 divisions in one lift made this the largest single-day airborne drop in history. At 10 a.m. British and American airborne troops belonging to the 6th Airborne Division and 17th Airborne Division began landing on German soil, some 13 hours after the Allied ground assault began. 6th Airborne Division, the first British airborne unit to land, was the 8th Parachute Battalion, part of 3rd Parachute Brigade, and commanded by Brigadier James Hill. The brigade actually dropped 9 minutes earlier than scheduled, but successfully landed in Drop Zone A. While facing significant small arms and 20mm anti-aircraft fire, the brigade suffered a number of casualties as it engaged the German forces in the Diersviertelwald. But by 1100 hours the drop zone was all but completely clear of enemy forces and all battalions of the brigade had formed up. The key place of Schnappenberg was captured by the 9th Parachute Battalion in conjunction with the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, the latter unit having lost its commanding officer to German small arms fire only moments after he had landed. Despite taking casualties, the brigade cleared the area of German forces, and by 1345 Brigadier Hill could report that the brigade had secured all of its objectives. Canadian Medical Orderly Corporal Frederick George Topham was awarded the Victoria Cross for his efforts to recover casualties and take them for treatment. Despite his own wounds and great personal danger, the next British airborne unit to land was the 5th Parachute Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Nigel Poet. The brigade was designated to land on Drop Zone B and achieved this, although not as accurately as 3rd Parachute Brigade, due to poor visibility around the drop zone, which also made it more difficult for paratroopers of the brigade to rally. The drop zone came under heavy fire from German troops stationed nearby, and was subjected to shell fire and mortaring, which inflicted casualties in the battalion rendezvous areas. However, 7th Parachute Battalion soon cleared the DZ of German troops, many of whom were situated in farms and houses, and the 12th Parachute Battalion and 13th Parachute Battalion rapidly secured the rest of the brigade's objectives. The brigade was then ordered to move due east and clear an area near Schnappenberg, as well as to engage German forces gathered to the west of the farmhouse where the 6th Airborne Division headquarters was established. By 1530 Brigadier Poet reported that the brigade had secured all of its objectives and linked up with other British airborne units. The 3rd Airborne Unit that formed a part of the 6th Airborne Division was the 6th Air Landing Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Hugh Bellamy. The brigade was tasked with landing in company-sized groups and capturing several objectives, including the town of Hamminkeln. The gliders containing the airborne troops of the brigade landed in landing zones P, O, U and R under considerable anti-aircraft fire, the landing being made even more difficult due to the presence of a great deal of haze and smoke. This resulted in a number of glider pilots being unable to identify their landing areas and losing their bearings. A number of gliders landed in the wrong areas or crashed. However, the majority of the gliders survived, allowing the battalions of the brigade to secure and tack the 3 bridges over the River Issel that they had been tasked with capturing, as well as the village of Hamminkeln with the aid of the US 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which had been dropped by mistake nearby. The brigade secured all of its objectives shortly after capturing Hamminkeln. 17th Airborne Division, the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, under the command of Colonel Edson Rath, was the lead assault formation for the 17th Airborne Division, and was consequently the first American airborne unit to land as part of Operation Varsity. The entire regiment was meant to be dropped in Drop Zone W, a clearing 2 miles north of Issel. However, excessive ground haze confused the pilots of the transport aircraft carrying the regiment, and as such when the regiment dropped it split into 2 halves. Colonel Rath and approximately 690 of his paratroopers landed northwest of the drop zone near the town of Deersford. with the rest of the regiment successfully landing in Drop Zone W. The colonel rallied his separated paratroopers and led them to Drop Zone W, engaging a battery of German artillery en route, killing or capturing the artillery crews before reuniting with the rest of the regiment. By 2 p.m., the 507th PIR had secured all of its objectives and cleared the area around Deersford, having engaged numerous German troops and also destroying a German tank. The actions of the regiment during the initial landing also gained the division its second Medal of Honor, when Private George J. Peters posthumously received the award after charging a German machine gun nest and eliminating it with rifle fire and grenades, allowing his fellow paratroopers to gather their equipment and capture the regiment's first objective. The 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment was the second American airborne unit to land after the 507th, under the command of Colonel James Kautz. En route to the drop zone, the transport aircraft carrying the 513th had the misfortune to pass through a belt of German anti-aircraft weapons, losing 22 of the C-46 transport aircraft and damaging a further 38. Just as the 507th had, the 513th also suffered from pilot error due to the ground haze, and as such the regiment actually missed its designated drop zone, DZX, and was dropped on one of the landing zones designated for the British 6th Air Landing Brigade. Despite this inaccuracy, the paratroopers swiftly rallied and aided the British glider-borne troops who were landing simultaneously, eliminating several German artillery batteries that were covering the area. Once the German troops in the area had been eliminated, a combined force of American and British airborne troops stormed Hamminkeln and secured the town. By 2 p.m., Colonel Kautz reported to the divisional headquarters that the 513th had secured all of its objectives, having knocked out 2 tanks and 2 complete regiments of artillery during their assault. During its attempts to secure its objectives, the regiment also gained a third Medal of Honor for the division when Private First Class Stuart S. Stryker posthumously received the award after leading a charge against a German machine gun nest, creating a distraction to allow the rest of his platoon to capture the fortified position in which the machine gun was situated. The third component of the 17th Airborne Division to take part in the operation was the 194th Glider Infantry Regiment, under the command of Colonel James Pierce. Troopers of the 194th GIR landed accurately in Landing Zone S, but their gliders and tow aircraft took heavy casualties. 12 C-47 transports were lost due to anti-aircraft fire, and a further 140 were damaged by the same fire. The regiment landed in the midst of a number of German artillery batteries that were engaging Allied ground forces crossing the Rhine, and as such many of the gliders were engaged by German artillery pieces that had their barrels lowered for direct fire. However, these artillery batteries and their crews were defeated by the glider-borne troops, and the 194th was soon able to report that its objectives had been secured, having destroyed 42 artillery pieces, 10 tanks, 2 self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicles and 5 self-propelled guns.